One of the greatest starting pitchers in baseball history died on Monday. Tom Seaver passed peacefully in his sleep of complications of Lewy body dementia and COVID-19, according to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
He was the franchise. He was one of a kind. He's a Hall of Famer's Hall of Famer.
Tom Seaver's life was a story where MLB destroyed him. On August 31st, 2020, baseball lost one of its greatest legends when George Thomas Seaver passed away at the age of 75. The official cause was complications from Lewy body dementia and COVID-19, but his death was just the final chapter in a life that was defined by towering achievement and profound institutional betrayal. This was a man who gave everything to his team, only to have his loyalty thrown back in his face. His wife, Nancy Seaver, put it best when she said, "With him, it was a matter of loyalty, and his loyalty was thrown into his face." Tom Seaver, known as Tom Terrific and the franchise, was the heart and soul of the New York Mets. But before we talk about how he became a legend, we need to talk about how the organization that he built turned its back on him in the cruelest way possible. The story of Tom Seaver's betrayal begins in the mid-1970s. Baseball was changing. The reserve clause had ended and a new era of free agency was born. Player salaries were exploding across the league. In 1974, Catfish Hunter signed a massive deal with the Yankees worth $3.75 million. The financial power of players was growing, and the old guard in baseball management hated it. Tom Seaver was the undisputed ace of the Mets. He had earned 3 Cy Young Awards and was one of the best pitchers in the entire game. By 1977, he was seeking a 3-year contract worth $800,000. This was not some outrageous demand. The highest salary in MLB that year was $560,000, earned by Mike Schmidt. Nolan Ryan, Seaver's contemporary, was also earning $560,000 and would soon become baseball's first $1 million a year player in 1980. Seaver was simply asking for what he was worth. He was staking his claim as the league's top star, and his performance on the mound justified every dollar. But Mets chairman M. Donald Grant refused to negotiate in good faith. Grant was a buttoned-down, authoritarian Wall Street stockbroker who fiercely resisted the new economic order. He had tight-fisted fiscal policies that drew criticism from everyone. The conflict between Grant and Seaver quickly became less about money and more about power and control. Grant viewed the new era of player empowerment as a threat to the established hierarchy. He believed players should accept wages comparable to the average American worker. Seaver later recalled 2 statements from Grant that showed what he called the chairman's total plantation mentality. During labor negotiations, Grant confronted Seaver and asked, "What are you, some sort of communist?" He also questioned Seaver's social aspirations, asking, "Who do you think you are, joining the Greenwich Country Club?" These statements were not about business. They were about keeping a player in his place. Grant viewed Seaver's attempt to achieve market value not as a simple business transaction, but as an act of moral failure. The professional disagreement was fundamentally philosophical. It was a traditional management model fighting against player autonomy. The trade that would eventually happen was not because the Mets could not afford Seaver. It was a punitive act. Grant chose to dismantle the franchise cornerstone rather than concede that the player deserved economic mobility. Seaver was being thwarted by spiteful ideology. The frustration that Seaver felt during this period cannot be overstated. He had been with the Mets since the beginning of his professional career. He had carried the franchise on his back. He had transformed them from a laughingstock into World Series champions in 1969. That championship team, the Miracle Mets, was built around his arm and his leadership. He was not just another player looking for a payday. He was the face of the franchise. He was the reason fans came to Shea Stadium. He was the reason the Mets were relevant. And yet he was being treated like he was asking for something he did not deserve. The disrespect was palpable. Grant's refusal to acknowledge Seaver's value was not just bad business. It was a personal insult. It was a message that no matter how much Seaver had accomplished, no matter how much he had given to the organization, he would never be seen as anything more than a worker who should be grateful for whatever crumbs the owners decided to throw his way. This corporate hubris and media manipulation forced the greatest pitcher in their history out of town. What's your take? Should a player's career be ended because management allows an attack on his family? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories of professional sports betrayal, be sure to subscribe. While Grant's financial obstinance created the professional stalemate, the ultimate catalyst that forced Seaver out of New York was a newspaper columnist named Dick Young. Young wrote for the New York Daily News and consistently positioned himself as an advocate for management against the perceived greed of players. He frequently attacked Seaver in his articles, but here is where things get really troubling. Young's son-in-law, Thornton Geary, was employed by the Mets organization. Grant himself had hired him. This direct connection suggests that Young was acting as a public relations attack dog for the front office. He was possibly receiving insider information to craft his caustic columns. Young painted Seaver as greedy and deceptive. He argued that Seaver was merely masking his desire for hard cash with talk of team competitiveness. The relationship between Young and the Mets front office was deeply unethical. political. Here was a journalist who was supposed to be reporting objectively on the team, but he had a direct financial connection to the organization through his son-in-law's employment. This was a massive conflict of interest. Young was essentially being used as a propaganda tool by Grant. His job was not to inform the public. His job was to shape public opinion against Seaver. He was there to make Seaver look bad so that when the trade eventually happened, the fans would blame Seaver instead of blaming the front office. It was a calculated strategy. It was media manipulation at its worst, and it worked. Many fans, influenced by Young's relentless attacks, began to see Seaver as the problem. They began to believe that he was being selfish. They began to think that maybe he was asking for too much. This was exactly what Grant wanted. He wanted the narrative to be about Seaver's greed, not about his own refusal to pay a fair market value. But the breaking point occurred when Young transformed the professional discord into an irreparable personal betrayal. In a particularly nasty and unsubstantiated story, Young claimed that Seaver's wife Nancy was the driving force behind the demands for a higher salary. Young wrote that Nancy was envious of her friend, Ruth Ryan, whose husband Nolan Ryan was earning more money. This was a lie. It was a cruel personal attack designed to humiliate Seaver and his family. Seaver was reportedly furious and incensed that Young had dragged his wife into it. This was the final blow. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The attack on his family's integrity was intolerable. Seaver immediately confronted the front office and demanded a trade. He stated definitively that he was done with the Mets. The trade that followed was a forced exit. It was predicated on profound personal betrayal rather than simple contractual necessity. This sequence of events demonstrates the power of media manipulation to dictate the fate of a superstar. Seaver was willing to fight for his contract, but he would not endure an environment where management permitted, or perhaps orchestrated, a public smear campaign against his personal life. The decision to drag Nancy Seaver into the dispute was particularly vile. Nancy had nothing to do with the contract negotiations. She was not demanding anything. She was simply supporting her husband in his efforts to get paid what he was worth. But Young saw an opportunity to inflict maximum damage. He knew that by attacking Nancy, he would hit Seaver where it hurt most. He knew that Seaver would not tolerate his wife being slandered in the press. And he was right. The attack on Nancy was the one thing that Seaver could not forgive. It was the one thing that made reconciliation impossible. Young had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in doing so, he had ensured that Tom Seaver would never wear a Mets uniform again, at least not for a very long time. In the final hours of June 15, 1977, the trade was executed. It was dubbed the Midnight Massacre. Tom Seaver, who at 32 was 7-3 with a 3.00 ERA and widely considered the best pitcher in the game, was sent to the Cincinnati Reds. In return, the Mets received Pat Zachary, Doug Flynn, Steve Henderson, and Dan Norman. These were four players collectively described in the New York Times as being of far less magnitude. To compound the disaster, slugger Dave Kingman, who was also involved in a contract dispute, was traded to the San Diego Padres that same night. The public reaction in New York was immediate and overwhelming. The New York Daily News dedicated its entire front page to the story. The headline screamed, "Mets deal stars, Seaver to Reds, Kingman to SD." The Mets switchboard was flooded with telephone calls, mostly of protest, many of them very abusive. It was described as the strongest display of anger ever recorded there. The day after the trade, Mets fans were in a state of shock and disbelief. How could the organization trade away the greatest player in franchise history? How could they let Tom Seaver go? The answer was simple. Donald Grant's ego and his outdated ideology were more important to him than winning baseball games. He would rather destroy the team than admit that he was wrong. He would rather lose the best pitcher in baseball than pay him what he was worth. The Midnight Massacre was not just a bad trade. It was an act of organizational sabotage. It was a deliberate decision to prioritize ideology over success, and the fans knew it. They knew that Grant had destroyed their team. They knew that the Mets would not be competitive for years to come, and they were right. The organizational collapse that followed was immediate and prolonged. Grant's decision to jettison Seaver rather than meet a market demand was a short-term financial saving that resulted in a systemic decline. Grant continued his refusal to sign free agents. The franchise was thrust into a full rebuild that devolved into a 7-year miserable stretch. From 1977 to 1983, the Mets won just 434 games and lost 641. That is an overall win percentage of 40.4%. The lack of competitiveness caused attendance to plummet. Detractors across the city began mockingly referring to Shea Stadium as Grant's tomb, a reference to the monument honoring Ulysses S. Grant. Donald Grant became a public laughingstock. He was widely viewed as the chief culprit for the gutted franchise. The severity of the public and competitive backlash eventually led to his downfall. In November 1978, the Mets board of directors relieved Grant of his duties as board chairman. His disgraced status was confirmed when he made only discreet entrances to Shea Stadium thereafter, fearing the fan reception. The financial saving achieved by denying Seaver his justified contract was ultimately dwarfed by the total loss of fan interest and competitive failure over the subsequent decade. The Midnight Massacre serves as a definitive case study in how owner hubris, driven by ideological spite, can financially and emotionally ruin a major corporate asset. mindset. The 7 years that followed the trade were some of the darkest in Mets history. The team was terrible, the fans stopped coming to games, the organization became a joke, and all of it could have been avoided if Emma Donald Grant had simply paid Tom Seaver what he was worth. Instead, Grant chose pride over pragmatism. He chose ideology over success, and he paid the price. His removal from the chairmanship in 1978 was a humiliating end to his tenure. He had taken a championship-caliber team and turned it into a laughingstock. He had taken the best pitcher in baseball and traded him for a handful of mediocre players, and he had destroyed the trust and goodwill of an entire fan base. Grant's legacy is one of failure and stubbornness. He is remembered not for any success he brought to the Mets, but for the damage he inflicted on the franchise. The name Grant's tomb was a fitting epitaph for his tenure. It was a reminder that his decisions had killed the team. The players who came to the Mets in exchange for Seaver never lived up to expectations. Pat Zachary, Doug Flynn, Steve Henderson, and Dan Norman were serviceable players, but none of them came close to matching Seaver's impact. The trade was lopsided from the start. The Mets gave up a Hall of Fame pitcher in his prime and received 4 players who would be forgotten footnotes in baseball history. It was a disaster of epic proportions. And every time one of those players stepped onto the field at Shea Stadium, it was a reminder to the fans of what they had lost. The trade haunted the organization for years. It became the defining moment of a terrible era, and it all happened because of one man's stubbornness and spite. Despite the bitterness of his departure, Seaver demonstrated remarkable professional resilience. His tenure with the Cincinnati Reds proved that his excellence was not dependent on the Mets organization. It was a successful second act in his Hall of Fame career. Over 6 seasons with the Reds, Seaver won 75 games. He led the National League in wins in 1981, securing his continuing status as an elite pitcher. He did experience a brief redemptive return to the Mets in 1983. However, even this momentary reconciliation ended in another organizational blunder. This reinforced the perception that the Mets management was incapable of properly managing the franchise. Following the 1983 season, the Mets failed to protect Seaver on their roster's unprotected list for the free agent compensation. This was an act of sloppy management that allowed the Chicago White Sox to pluck him away. The loss was particularly acute because the subsequent vacant spot in the starting rotation allowed a young rookie named Dwight Gooden to make the team coming out of spring training in 1984. Seaver finished his career with the White Sox and Boston Red Sox. He achieved his 300th victory and retired with an unparalleled career mark of 311 wins, a 2.86 ERA, and 3,640 strikeouts. The 1983 return to the Mets was supposed to be a feel-good story. Seaver was back in New York. He was back where he belonged. The fans were thrilled. For a brief moment, it seemed like the wrongs of the past could be forgiven, but the Mets front office managed to mess it up again. Their failure to protect Seaver on the roster was not a malicious act like the 1977 trade. It was simply incompetence. It was organizational sloppiness, but the result was the same. Seaver was gone. Once again, the Mets had lost their greatest player because the front office could not get its act together. The pattern was clear. Whether it was ideological spite or simple incompetence, the Mets organization could not hold on to Tom Seaver. They did not deserve him. They had never deserved. The fact that Seaver was traded once due to ideological spite and lost a second time due to organizational negligence suggests that the initial betrayal was symptomatic of a deep-seated pathology within the franchise. It proved that the Mets organization rarely did right by the franchise. This lack of respect continued into his retirement. Years after his Hall of Fame election, Nancy Seaver publicly expressed being embarrassed for the Mets due to their perceived failure to properly honor her husband. Following his playing career, Seaver transitioned into broadcasting. He worked as a television color commentator for both the Mets and Yankees. This public role allowed him to maintain a connection to the game he loved. It bridged his legendary status with continuous fan engagement, even while physically distanced from the New York chaos. Even in retirement, the disrespect continued. The Mets never fully honored Seaver the way they should have. They never fully acknowledged the debt they owed him. Nancy Seaver's public statement about being embarrassed for the Mets was a damning indictment of the organization. Here was the wife of the greatest player in franchise history saying that the team had failed to properly honor her husband. That is a stain on the organization that can never be fully washed away. Seaver deserved better. He deserved to be treated like the legend he was. But the Mets, true to form, could not even get that right. Seaver's broadcasting career allowed him to stay connected to baseball in a meaningful way. He provided analysis and commentary for games. He shared his knowledge and experience with a new generation of fans. He remained a respected voice in the sport. But even this phase of his life was tinged with the bitterness of what had happened to him as a player. Every time he stepped into a broadcast booth, every time he talked about the game, there must have been a part of him that remembered the betrayal. There must have been a part of him that wondered wondered what his career could have been if the Mets had simply treated him with the respect he deserved. The what-ifs must have haunted him. What if Grant had paid him? What if Young had not attacked his wife? What if the Mets had protected him in 1983? These questions could never be answered. The past could not be changed. And so Seaver carried on, broadcasting games and trying to find peace with the way his career had unfolded. The contrast between what Seaver accomplished and how he was treated is one of the most frustrating aspects of his story. Here was a man who transformed an expansion team into champions. He was the centerpiece of the Miracle Mets. He gave New York one of its greatest sports moments. And yet, when it came time to compensate him fairly, the organization balked. When it came time to show him loyalty, they showed him the door instead. The betrayal was complete and total, and it left scars that never fully healed. Even decades later, even after he had achieved every honor the game could bestow, the memory of how the Mets treated him lingered. It was a wound that never closed. But the ultimate tragedy of Tom Seaver's life was the slow, inexorable decline of his once dominant mind and body due to complex neurological conditions. And this personal battle began long before his death. It stemmed from a severe, persistent environmental disease. Seaver's medical history included an initial diagnosis of Lyme disease in 1991. He contracted it while working in his garden in Connecticut. The tick-borne illness reoccurred around 2012. This marked the beginning of clear and distressing neurological involvement. The recurrence caused a variety of debilitating symptoms. These included the onset of Bell's palsy and significant memory loss. By 2013, reports indicated that Seaver was suffering from severe memory impairment. He had difficulty recognizing long-term acquaintances. He experienced a sleep disorder, nausea, and a general overall feeling of chemical imbalance. Former teammates, such as Bud Harrelson, noted that he would forget things that happened just a few minutes before. This decade of cognitive decline culminated in the formal diagnosis of Lewy body dementia in 2019. Lewy body dementia is the second most common form of dementia. The decline of Tom Seaver's health was heartbreaking to witness. Here was a man who had been one of the greatest athletes of his generation. He had been sharp, intelligent, and fiercely competitive, and now his mind was failing him. The memory loss was particularly cruel. Seaver could not remember conversations he had just had. He could not recognize people he had known for decades. The disease was robbing him of his identity. It was stealing his memories. It was taking away everything that made him who he was. For someone who had spent his entire life in control, who had mastered his craft to a degree that few ever have, the loss of control over his own mind must have been unbearable. The frustration and sadness that Seaver and his family must have felt during this period is unimaginable. The symptoms of Lewy body dementia are devastating. The memory loss is just one part of it. The disease also causes visual hallucinations, motor problems, and severe cognitive impairment. Patients often experience fluctuations in their mental state where they can be alert and coherent one moment and confused and disoriented the next. This unpredictability makes the disease especially difficult for families to manage. For Nancy Seaver, watching her husband slowly fade away must have been agonizing. She had stood by him through the betrayals and the disappointments of his playing career. She had supported him through everything, and now she had to watch as the disease took him from her piece by piece. The Seaver family's decision to publicly announce his diagnosis in 2019 was an act of courage. They wanted people to understand what was happening. They wanted to raise awareness about dementia and the challenges it presents. And they wanted to give Tom the privacy and dignity he deserved in his final years. The connection between Seaver's history of Lyme disease and his subsequent development of Lewy body dementia introduces a crucial element of medical complexity to his final years. Emerging medical research suggests a possible correlation between persistent chronic Lyme infection and the onset of severe neurological diseases like Lewy body dementia. A case study involving a patient who experienced years of neurocognitive impairment following Lyme diagnosis and treatment found evidence of persistent Lyme bacteria in the brain tissue of the patient, who ultimately succumbed to Lewy body dementia. Researchers are actively investigating the role that persistent Lyme bacteria may play in facilitating the progression of dementia. This perspective frames Seaver's death not merely as a consequence of advanced age, but as a drawn-out, medically complex tragedy initiated by a chronic, often misunderstood environmental illness. The fact that Lyme disease may have contributed to Seaver's dementia adds another layer of tragedy to his story. Lyme disease is often dismissed as a minor illness, but in Seaver's case, it may have been the beginning of the end. The reoccurrence of the disease in 2012 marked the start of his neurological decline, and over the next 8 years, his condition only got worse. The emerging research into the connection between Lyme disease and dementia is still in its early stages, but the evidence is mounting that chronic Lyme infection can have devastating long-term effects on the brain. Seaver may have been a victim of this connection. His death may have been the result of an environmental illness that was never fully understood or treated. It is a sobering reminder that even the greatest among us are vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The frustration of his final years was the inability to combat the irreversible decline of his cognitive function. This forced him into isolation. He retired from public life. The family formally announced his diagnosis with dementia in March 2019. He immediately retired from public life. This retirement meant the legendary pitcher was unable to join his former teammates in New York to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Miracle Mets World Series championship. This was a team he defined. His quiet dignity in his final years was spent away from the professional chaos. He cultivated Seaver vineyards with his family in Calistoga, California. This stands in sharp contrast to the furious and toxic environment that forced his 1977 departure. His peaceful passing on August 31, 2020, from complications of Lewy body dementia and the COVID-19 virus, sadly confirms that his final days were characterized by the acute vulnerability associated with terminal neurological disease during a global pandemic. The fact that Seaver could not attend the 50th anniversary celebration of the 1969 Miracle Mets was another cruel twist of fate. That championship was the defining moment of his career. It was the moment when he became a legend, and he could not be there to celebrate it. He could not share in the joy and the memories with his former teammates. He was isolated in California, battling a disease that was slowly taking everything from him. The contrast between the Seaver of 1969 and the Seaver of 2019 is stark. In 1969, he was young, strong, and at the peak of his powers. In 2019, he was old, sick, and fading away. The passage of time had been cruel to him, and the disease had robbed him of the chance to fully enjoy his legacy. The final indignity came in 2020 when Seaver contracted COVID-19. Already weakened by Lewy body dementia, his body could not fight off the virus. The combination of chronic neurological disease and acute viral infection was too much. On August 31, 2020, Tom Seaver died peacefully in his sleep. He was 75 years old. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the baseball world. Tributes poured in from all over. Players, coaches, and fans all mourned the loss of one of the greatest pitchers in history. But the sadness was tinged with frustration. Seaver had deserved better. He had deserved a long, happy retirement. He had deserved to be honored and celebrated. Instead, his final years were marked by illness, isolation, and decline. It was a tragic end to a tragic story. But despite all of this tragedy, all of this frustration, and all of this betrayal, Tom Seaver's legacy is defined by his resilience, his excellence, and his unbreakable connection to the Mets fans who adored him. He finished his career with statistics that place him among the greatest pitchers in history. This was confirmed by his near-unanimous Hall of Fame election in 1992. He received 98.8% of the vote. This was the highest percentage ever recorded at the time. The life of Tom Seaver encapsulates a powerful narrative of American sports tragedy. Towering individual achievement was constantly undermined by institutional failure and personal illness. The frustration he experienced in 1977, driven by the ideological malice of MS Donald Grant and the unethical journalism of Dick Young, not only forced him from the team he defined, but directly caused a decade of organizational ruin. The era was characterized by the ignominious label Grant's Tomb. His story serves as a profound cautionary tale. It is a reminder that corporate hubris and media manipulation can inflict deep, lasting wounds. But true greatness transcends the petty conflicts created by those who oppose progress. Seaver remains and always will be the heart and soul of the Mets. The Hall of Fame vote in 1992 was a testament to Seaver's greatness. 98.8% of voters selected him on their ballot. This was the highest percentage ever recorded at that time. It was a near-unanimous recognition of his place among the all-time greats. The voters understood what the Mets front office never did. They understood that Tom Seaver was special. They understood that he was a once-in-a-generation talent. They understood that he deserved to be celebrated and honored. The Hall of Fame induction was a validation of everything Seaver had accomplished. It was proof that his legacy would endure long after the petty conflicts and betrayals of his playing days had been forgotten. Tom Seaver's story is one of triumph and tragedy. He achieved greatness on the baseball field. He won championships, he won awards, he became a legend, but he was also betrayed by the organization he loved. He was attacked by the media. He was denied the respect and compensation he deserved. And in the end, he was struck down by a terrible disease that robbed him of his memories and his dignity. It is a story that should make us angry. It should make us frustrated. It should make us demand better from the institutions that control professional sports. Players like Tom Seaver give everything to their teams. They sacrifice their bodies, they dedicate their lives to the game, and they deserve to be treated with respect and fairness. When they are not, when they are betrayed and discarded, it is a stain on the entire sport. His vineyard in Calistoga became his sanctuary in those final years. Away from the noise and chaos of New York, Seaver found peace among the grapevines. He worked the land with his hands, much like he had done in that Connecticut garden where he first contracted Lyme disease. The vineyard represented a new chapter, a quiet escape from the betrayals and frustrations that had marked his baseball career. It was a place where he could be himself, where he did not have to be Tom Terrific or the franchise. He could just be Tom Seaver, a man who loved working with his hands and watching things grow. But even this peaceful sanctuary could not protect him from the ravages of disease that were slowly consuming his mind. The irony is painful to consider. Seaver escaped New York to find peace in California. He built a life cultivating grapes and making wine. He created something beautiful and lasting with his own hands. And yet, the disease that would eventually kill him started in a garden. It started with a tick bite while he was doing the very thing thing that brought him joy. Working with the land, creating something from nothing. The same drive that made him a great pitcher, the same work ethic and attention to detail led him to gardening. And that garden, that peaceful place where he found solace, became the source of his ultimate downfall. It is a cruel twist that adds yet another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. That is the story of Tom Seaver, a man who gave everything to his team only to have his loyalty thrown back in his face. Let us know what you think about the franchise and hit the like button if you want more stories that showcase the tragic side of sports greatness.